Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So in the last couple of talks that I've had on this nanoparticles and colloids, right? They were more kind of aimed at giving you a very basics of particulate matter, motivation for studying them and stuff like that. And today what I thought is I will discuss something that you can easily relate to, okay? Something that you may have seen for sure. Yet think about some really nice fundamental scientific questions that people ask in a particular field, okay? So in that context, I made this particular, talk, if you want to call it as, okay? Kind of titled it as a coffee ring or coffee stain, okay? Any thoughts on what it could be? Any thoughts? So how many of you, that's going to be outlined, we'll come back, okay? How many of you drink coffee and tea? How many? Okay, quite a few. Okay, okay. Yeah, good, thanks. So there's no reason why, people have called it as, I think the reason this coffee ring or coffee stain came about because they observed something with the coffee, okay, and they found it interesting to name it like a coffee ring or a coffee stain. Okay, this phenomena, if somebody had seen this particular phenomena, and if he was a tea drinker, he could have called it as a tea ring or a tea stain. Okay, there's no reason why, okay, this particular phenomena is called coffee ring or coffee stain. It is a general phenomena that occurs in a lot of things, which I'm going to discuss in the next 1 hour or so, right? And so, as I said, so, okay, you can, so Chennai is famous for coffee, right? Everybody drinks coffee, right? But, it turns out that, whenever you're drinking coffee, there's always going to be some coffee spill, right? Maybe, when you're trying to take it, it may spill on a, like say table, for example, it may spill on the shirt, it may spill on the saucer, right? And so this talk is going to be about something, about coffee spills, right? Now, of course, this is of course, coffee can spill in a very complex way, right? Depending upon, different things. But one of the simplest configurations I can think of is a coffee drop, a drop of coffee, for example, and that is basically falls on a saucer. It could be a table, it could be a floor, right? Now, so ingredients of coffee, right? If you want to understand what happens, when the coffee spill dries, right? You should understand what the ingredients are. Coffee, as you know, it has coffee particles. These are some SEM image of coffee particles in the coffee that we drink, the coffee powder, right? If when you disperse them in water and look under a microscope, there are a lot of these coffee particles. Of course, it has milk, right? There's milk. Depending upon whether people drink black coffee or tea or coffee with milk, there's going to be some milk or no milk, right? And of course, there's going to be some sugar, right? And some people may prefer to drink coffee or tea without sugar as well, right? So therefore, in a nutshell, you can think about coffee as a aqueous dispersion of coffee particles, right? I mean, going by what we have discussed in the last couple of lectures, okay, I can call coffee as an aqueous dispersion of coffee particles, and the dispersed phase is coffee particles mostly. There could be some fat molecules and proteins that come from the milk, right? Because milk has, fat molecules depending upon, whether you're buying 2% toned milk, all that, right? There's going to be some fat molecules, plus there's going to be some protein, right? There's casein, casein molecules and stuff like that, okay? So therefore, your dispersed phase in the coffee would be coffee particles, fat molecules and protein. And the continuous phase would be mostly water, right? Coffee is mostly a water-based drink, right? And of course, milk that you add, right? Apart from fat molecules and proteins, it also has a lot of water, right? More than 85% of milk is water, right? There's only small amount of solid contents. And of course, there could be some sugar molecules if you want to call it that, right? So that's your, the coffee spill would consist of. And therefore, you can think about generalizing the coffee spill problem, okay? This generalization, I can say that, look, I'm going to consider a drop containing soluble or insoluble substances, okay? In this case, soluble substances could be, in the case of coffee, it could be sugar, molecules, right? And insoluble would be something like coffee particles, because they are dispersed entities, right? They are not soluble. They exist as particles, for example. Therefore, particles, fat molecules and whey proteins are insoluble substances, okay? They don't dissolve, but they disperse, right? So therefore, and all that we're going to ask is, what happens if you have a configuration like this and all the liquid from the drop evaporates, and what is left after drying or evaporation of solvent is what we're going to ask a question, right? Is the problem statement clear? Right? We are talking about a case where I have a substrate, there's a liquid drop, and liquid drop contains some soluble or insoluble stuff. There's also a little bit of liquid, in this case liquid is water, and we ask a question about what happens if you evaporate the liquid, okay? Because we know that, even if you take a drop of water, put it on table, after a while it's all gone, right? It evaporates into the atmosphere, all the water molecules are lost, right? And so we ask a question as to what happens to the distribution of particles in the liquid after the liquid is evaporated. Where do they stay on the substrate? Okay, that's the kind of question. Okay, so I've kind of introduced so far coffee as a particulate dispersion. I've told you about what the coffee essentially has, which most of you know already, right? And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this coffee spills and the resulting drying patterns. So for that, me and my daughter, we did some simple experiments, okay, right? And what we did is we prepared a coffee without milk, okay, it's a decoction, right? And we also made a tea without any milk, right? Okay, black tea and black coffee. And we wrote certain things, okay, this PECS, okay, PECS stands for our lab, Polymer Engineering Colloid Science Lab, and we made some shapes, some triangle, square, and hexagon, for example, and CHE stands for Chemical Engineering, and IIT Madras, right? We made all these things, right? And this is all the dried patterns, right? Now, so this is all the names, right? But if you look at carefully at all these deposits, okay, if you look at it carefully, so if I take one of them and expand a little bit, do you see something that is interesting? Right? The border, seems to have a darker color, right? The border seems to have a darker color compared to the interior of the droplet, right? And see, if I made a droplet in this particular shape, right? If initially the coffee particles or whatever that you had in the drop were homogeneously dispersed, but looks like post evaporation things are maybe gone to the edge, and it looks like there's a more darker color, right? Maybe that's the only thing that's important, right? And of course, you can as I said, you can do this with coffee spill, or you can do it with tea spill, exactly similar result, okay? Okay, what I'm trying to say is that this particular phenomena is very common to, or it's same whenever for any kind of experiments where I have liquid and particles, right? Or liquid plus some dispersed matter, right? And this particular problem of what happens if you have a droplet containing particles, it was actually investigated again way back, okay? Robert Brown, I gave an example. So what he did was, because he was trying to understand the pollen grains and stuff like that, he had a good microscope, and he put in a drop which contained these pollen particles, and when he was observing, okay, things under a microscope, he was seeing that the pollen grains were moving very fast or slow, and he kind of trying to relate that to origin of life, and the pollen particles have life itself, okay? That's what he was trying to relate it to. But later on, there are some really nice experiments that came about, again, quite late, okay? very close to the end of last century, 1997, where people kind of understood, okay, what is the reason for the formation of such dried patterns, okay. And this is a kind of a picture that you would see if you Google for coffee ring, right? This is a kind of picture that you will get in the thing, right? So now if you, this is a coffee spill, as you can see, the edge, right, is definitely much darker here. You can go and look at any drop, for example, here, right? Edge is darker, you know, I can trace it to any. So therefore, this, it doesn't matter what is the shape of the coffee spill, right? It could be a nice droplet like that, or it could be very complex shape. And one, you know, when all the water is evaporated, you will always have a darker edge compared to deposition in the interior, right? And as I said, again, the original observation on drying drops with particles dates back to the work of Robert Brown, and then the controlled experiments and understanding of why such things form basically came up in 1997, right? Okay, so I've introduced what is coffee, right? I've told you that, you know, when things dry, okay, it forms nice deposits like this. Now, technological application. So do you think that, you know, what I've discussed so far is basically curiosity driven, that people wanted to kind of understand, you know, what happens if a coffee spills? Or do you think there are some technological applications of this simple process, okay? The simple process that we are referring to is a drop on a substrate, right? And drop with particulate matter, or it could be protein molecules, it could be DNA, it could be any soft matter, you know, system, and the evaporation of, you know, the liquid from the drop and leading to a deposition, right? So do you think this is a what I've discussed so far is mostly kind of applicable to the kitchen experiment, right, in terms of drying your coffee drop, or do you think it has more technological application?
Well, if we wanted to paint something, you have to like also draw a border, but instead if you just block this and then you have your border like this kind of that could be useful for something.
So what he's trying to say is that, you know, if you want to somebody who is a painter, if he wants to get a particular border, okay, with more color at the edge maybe, right? So what he's saying, no, you just put the ink that you're using for painting in a particular pattern, okay, and it automatically decides the border, right? Something like that is what he's saying, right? Yeah. Okay. Anything else? I'm talking about. Okay. Of course, there are applications in arts and stuff like that. Okay. There are people. There's a whole field where people think about drying drops, right, with particulate matter, and when these things dry, if the particle concentration is larger, the deposit that is formed, right, such deposits, they form what are called as cracks, okay. These are called evaporation driven cracks, very similar to what you see in the pond, right? When the pond dries, you know that there are a lot of nice cracks that appear, right? When there's if you see a pond that is completely dry or close to drying, okay, on the surface, you see some cracks, right? I don't know how many of you seen. They're called what are called as desiccation cracks, evaporation driven cracks, and, you know, people try and connect them to painting. So for example, if you take a, let's say, portrait of Mona Lisa, you know, very famous painting, if you look at those, because, you know, paint is also a particulate matter, right? There's a lot of stuff in it. You know, when it dries, it forms some different crack patterns, and people are trying to relate what is the year in which it was printed, you know, painted, and the connection between that and the crack and stuff. Okay, that's a separate story. But yeah, coming back to, you know, this technological applications. Okay, so there could be some applications in arts, but what about, is this technologically also important? Okay, that's a question. So therefore, I want you guys to imagine any process, okay, any industrial process that involves droplets. Yeah. Spray painting, yeah, that's an excellent example. spray painting, right? Anything else? Okay, so I'm going to give a few examples, right? So therefore, this simple thing of drops on surfaces and with particles and drying, it has a lot of technical applications. So one example is a spray coating, okay, or a spray coating, right? Spray painting. So what you have basically have is a nozzle, right? And through the nozzle, a liquid comes, right? And of course, this liquid would typically be a solution of maybe depending upon if it's a painting application. Of course, this liquid will have some particulate matter, it will have some polymer, and there's actually a gas stream, and the gas stream is typically given to atomize the liquid, right? So you want to break the continuous stream of liquid that is coming in through the nozzle. You want to break it into smaller droplets, and there's a possibility of moving this head in different direction or up and down as well. And whatever droplets that are formed, they are collected on a substrate, and in the end you basically end up with a nice film, okay, of paint on a substrate, right? This could be one example where if I want to break it down, the first thing that you should understand is what happens if a single droplet falls onto the substrate, right? And how do these continuous film forms, what happens to the continuous film after the evaporation of the solvent, right? You could ask questions like that, right? This is one example, spray coating, where you will come across drops sitting on a surface. The second example where you can think about drops is again a very famous and a very simple technique that is used a lot in food and other chemical industries. Is called spray drying. Okay, so again a very simple operation where again you have a liquid feed and there's an atomizer and there's a gas stream that basically breaks the liquid into small droplets, and that's a drying chamber. And as they come down through this chamber, okay, you kind of heat, maybe there are different ways of doing it. Either I can have a hot gas, okay, which will make the liquid in these droplets evaporate, or I can actually have the walls of this chamber heated up to high temperature so that all the liquid kind of evaporates, and after the liquid is lost, the dry solid particles can be collected, and then there are some applications of this. For example, this is a milk powder, right? Milk powder is basically made by this technique. Okay, what they do is they atomize milk, okay, into droplets, and then you remove the water in the milk by heating, and then you end up with milk powder. There are a lot of nice examples in the recent literature. For example, people have made aspirin, right, which is one of the molecules, right, that is used for it's an active pharmaceutical ingredient, right, used in tablets, right. So you can make aspirin loaded particles, for example. There's a lot of applications of spray drying in as I said, food, agriculture and pharmaceutical powder manufacture. So therefore, if you really want to understand, right, this how do these droplets dry, okay, what happens to the fate of the dispersed species in the droplets as the liquid is lost, is an interesting problem in the context of industrial applications as well. The third one is inkjet printing, right? Inkjet printing is again a very simple process in which you have a nozzle and there's a cartridge which contains the ink, and then drops of ink are basically produced. They are made to fall on a substrate, and then that's how you kind of get a printing in the end, right? So therefore it involves the droplet generation, collection of droplets on a substrate, and eventual evaporation of liquid from these droplets, and then the print quality basically depends on what kind of pattern is left after the liquid is evaporated. And the final example that I want to give is again agriculture, right? There's a lot of interest in delivery of nutrients, fungicides, herbicides, all kinds of stuff onto the crops. And one of the simple ways of doing it is basically spraying, right? And as you can imagine, these the droplets that are generated because of the spray, they basically get collected on the surface of these leaves. And of course, the leaves, the liquid basically evaporates and it leaves a pattern. And later on, it is going to be taken up by the, the leaf surface and all that, right? So therefore, this drops on surfaces, although it looks like a very simple process, is very much important technologically, right? Therefore, you can easily kind of relate it to what's happening. Yeah, please. Does this concept help in fingerprinting? See, fingerprinting, why would it help? Because I'm talking about a case where I have a drop with particles. In the fingerprinting, where is the liquid solution? And yeah, I don't see a connection. But you explain me, why do you think it has connection to fingerprinting? Mm-hmm.
Helps to find it, our fingerprint design.
So see, fingerprinting, the way it works is that whatever pattern that you have on the on the fingers, right? You're basically transferring that onto a some device where they basically capture a photo of that, right? Now I know that you can actually enhance the for example, if you take a kid, right, to like say Aadhaar, getting an Aadhaar card, right? Fingerprinting, when you do, you see that the many times fingerprinting doesn't work, right? What they do is they put a small amount of liquid, right, or actually a, what is it called, the sanitizer. If you put in, right, you can transfer the marks that you have on the finger directly onto this, right? But I think it doesn't involve evaporation as such. Okay, fingerprinting, where you are basically transferring whatever feature that you have on the finger onto some device which can be nicely captured. Okay, it involves more of imaging and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. See, but see, old method of fingerprinting, I mean, the pad that people talk about, right? The ink pads, right? It is still, transferring something on the basically it's a technique where you're transferring structures, the pattern that you have in the finger onto something, right? Of course, there could be some evaporation and stuff like that, but mostly, as you can imagine, it's just transferring the structure from one to the other, right? It doesn't involve so much of evaporation. Yeah, that could be something. So what he's trying to say is that, look, instead of thinking about this, using your hand, putting on a pad and then transferring it, what you do is you put your hand, okay, and then you basically somehow let the liquid kind of fill the gap between these structures, right? And then you take out your hand, right? Then hopefully, wherever there was a gap between these structures, they could dry in a particular fashion, and that could leave some, print on the, on the substrate, maybe. But yeah, I don't think I'm not aware of any connection between this to fingerprinting. Okay, let me put it that way and then move on. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any questions? So basically, as you can see, all these processes, right? Spray coating, spray drying, inkjet printing, and these agricultural processes, they basically involve formation of complex fluid drops. When I say complex fluid drop, these are drops containing some useful active ingredients. It could be particles, it could be a molecule that you want to deliver onto a plant, right? And invariably they reside on a solid surface, or they are kind of in gas or air, and ultimately there's a drying that is involved, right? Now, yeah.
Yeah, so in the coffee stains, we see that a lot of the coffee particles have spread to the edges. So let us say that we have a colloidal solution. Let us say we have a solution with multiple dispersed particles, different types of dispersed particles. Does the amount by which they disperse depend on the particle, or is it consistent for all particles?
That's a good question. Okay, so what he is trying to ask is, in the coffee, right? There are coffee particles I mentioned, but what if there are mixtures of particles? Okay, what if there is a nanoparticle plus micron size particle, particle that is spherical versus some complex shape. What happens to that? Maybe I'll try and answer that question at the end, okay? Because I want to show some nice movies and then I'll come back and answer that question, right? So I just want to introduce some very basic terminology so that we understand, technically what this is all about. So typically when you have a drop sitting on a substrate, people call it as a sessile drop, okay? And when you have a drop that is hanging from a surface, it's called a pendant drop. People also call it as hanging drop, if you want to, right? So in most of the examples that I shared, right, the drops were actually sitting on the substrate. Therefore, we're going to talk about what is called a sessile drop configuration in the next 10-15 minutes or so. Then people define this thing called, I mentioned that yesterday, in the last lecture, three-phase contact line. That is basically what is done is, I draw, so this is a liquid drop, right? That's a liquid drop, and that's a gas around it. If it's an ambient condition, it's going to be air, and there's a solid substrate where the liquid, the gas, and the solid meet. It forms a line, right? So the intersection of the three phases, right, gives you a line. That line is what is called a contact line. And what is done is, you draw a tangent at the the three-phase contact point, okay, and it's a tangent to the liquid surface, and that angle is what is called as theta c. In this particular case is called a contact angle. This contact angle depends on the surface tension, okay. That is a surface tension between the liquid and the gas, okay, and it depends on the surface tension between the solid and the liquid, solid and the vapor, and the solid and the liquid, right? So that's a famous equation called Young's equation, which basically relates the interfacial tensions, okay, or the surface energies of, okay, the three interfaces. In this case, the liquid gas, the solid liquid, and the solid gas interfacial tensions to the contact angle, right? Yeah, this number is not important at this point. We'll come back if it's required. Okay, so therefore, the terminology that I've introduced is three-phase contact angle, right? And how is the contact angle related to the interfacial tension by this particular expression? And this expression basically comes from a very simple force balance. Okay, so all that is done is, okay, at this point you ask what are the different forces acting at that location. It turns out there are three forces, okay, and all these forces are kind of balanced, okay. That's why it takes a shape like this, okay. And again, I mentioned this to you yesterday. So therefore, depending upon whether the contact angle is greater than 90 or less than 90 or equal to 90, people talk about hydrophilic surfaces. If the drop takes a contact angle less than 90, you're talking about a hydrophilic surface. If the contact angle is larger than 90, it's a hydrophobic surface. And if the contact angle is exactly 90, it's a neutrally wetting, okay, or neutral surface. Okay, it has equal affinity for both the fluid as well as the oil, if you want to call it as, right? And okay. Now, when drying occurs, right, I'm just trying to show you a side view of a drop that is on a surface, and that T that is indicated here, it represents the time, right? Now, that is your initial configuration of the drop surface. After a while, the drop surface takes this form. After a while, it takes this the dashed line here, and then that goes on, that continues until all the liquid is lost, right? And therefore, when I am able to view a drop from the side, right, when I have a drop substrate and a drop, when I'm able to see it from the side, I can do a very nice imaging, right? I can actually very simply measure what is this radius, okay? I can calculate this diameter, and half of that will give me what is the RC. It's called as a contact radius, okay, which is basically half this length, right? And I can monitor that as a function of time. Plus, I can also get the contact angle, right? I can draw a tangent here and get the contact angle. I can also monitor the contact angle or this angle as a function of time, right? Yeah, go ahead. So that depends on the type of drop, okay? So as I said, no, okay, let me just go back, right? So the configuration that I have drawn here, right, they kind of show what is called as a spherical cap shape, okay? It's a part of a sphere, right? You can think about, in this case, it's a sphere that is cut, okay, above the, the equal, whatever, the diametrically, right, a little bit above that, right? And now that shape is determined by what surface you take, okay, and all the interfacial energies, right? I could have a combination where I take a drop, it doesn't take the spherical cap shape, it spreads completely, right? I talked about yesterday what is called a super hydrophobic surface, right? In that case, it doesn't take this shape, okay? It will be a perfect circle, right? So therefore, the configuration of the drop on a surface is dictated by some of these factors. Okay? Right. So therefore, there are cases where if I look at the side view of the drop, the radius remains unchanged during time. Okay. However, the contact angle basically decreases because this tangent, right, it goes lower and lower, right? The contact angle decreases. So therefore, the drops can evaporate in a mode called as a constant contact radius mode of drying, okay, where this radius or this diameter doesn't change with time, okay, right? There is another mode which is called as a constant contact angle mode of drying, where this diameter is initially larger, then it reduces, right, from this point all the way up to this is the initial diameter, right? And next the diameter has actually decreased, it has further decreased. Therefore, if you measure radius as a function of time, this radius decreases. However, the contact angle remains same throughout the drying period, okay? This is what is called as a constant contact angle mode of drying. What is the implications of that? It will be more clear in the next slides to come. Yeah, please. How does? See, the super hydrophobic, hydrophobic or hydrophilic? Super hydrophobic, right? So, so typically, so if you look at super hydrophobic, right? That's a good point. So I've basically taken configuration where the contact angle is less than 180, right? So if you think about a super hydrophobic droplet, right? I mean, there are some nice experiments that people have done. See, if this is your initial, spherical drop, right? The spherical shape would remain the same. Only thing is it becomes smaller and smaller, right? It will continue to remain, spherical with a contact angle of, like 180, right? If you want to, if it is perfectly sphere, then, the contact, the tangent I would have to draw here, right? Therefore, the contact angle will be 180, and then, it will continue to take the shape of a sphere, and only, you should imagine a sphere shrinking, right? That's how it would. Yeah.
Sir, what properties of these droplets govern whether it will take constant radius?
That's a good point. Okay. I'll come back to that question again. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll come back to you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sir, how do we actually measure the contact angle of
So the contact angle measurement is very simple, right? In fact, there are sophisticated instruments available, which may cost something between, couple of lakhs to all the way up to, tens of lakhs, but you don't need that also, okay? Because typically what people do is, maybe I forgot to mention some of these things, typically we do experiments with 1 microliter drop, okay? Very, very small, right? Not even 1 ml, right? It is 1, this is 1, thousandth of an ml, right? Okay? So when you do that, if I take a substrate and if I put in a drop, right, this size, okay, this size would be about millimeter. Okay? Now we know there are cameras where I can see millimeter, very easily, right? Therefore, in fact, you can use your even cell phone cameras. Okay? I can, basically take my camera, you can look from the side, and there are a lot of nice image processing tools available. Yeah, I can get this contour, right, easily, right? Then I can draw a tangent, all that can be done. Okay, so yeah, you had a question.
Yes, so sir, on the previous slide,
Mhm.
In that you had an equation for bond number. Could you
Yeah.
explain that?
Okay, so this bond number, if you look at this term, right, there's a density difference here, right, and there's a gravity, right. The numerator, it tells you something about the force of gravity acting on the droplet, okay, and sigma tells you something about the interfacial tension, okay. So this bond number is basically the ratio of the force of gravity acting on the droplet, okay, versus the interfacial tension, okay. And this number is important because I said the drops will take a nice spherical cap shape, right. Now this is a case where the bond numbers are smaller, that means the interfacial tensions are more dominant. If the interfacial tension is not dominant, okay, if the gravity becomes important, what will happen is here, at the edge here, if you look up, it won't be a spherical cap shape, it will look more like, kind of curved like that, right. So basically, it is something that tells you something about the relative importance of gravity versus surface tension force. If the drop becomes too large, then the gravity overweighs and the bond number will be larger, right. And if it is a very small drop, the interfacial tensions are more dominant, so something like that, okay. I think in the interest of time, I should go a little faster. Okay, so explaining the drying patterns, right. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about, drying patterns. As I said, so particles in a fluid on a substrate, sessile drop configuration, evaporation of liquid, you get this ring like deposits, right. So it turns out that the ring like deposits actually form under certain conditions, okay. The first condition is that the solvent must evaporate, right. That means if I take a liquid drop like this with particles, and if I have a fluid that doesn't evaporate, okay, if I have a fluid that doesn't evaporate, for example, if I had oil, for example, right, I had oil and particles, and we know that under ambient conditions like 25 degrees centigrade, right, room temperature, oil will not evaporate, right. If I put a drop of water on a table versus a drop of like say sunflower oil, you come back after an hour or so, water escapes, but sunflower oil doesn't, right. Therefore, the first conditions for to observe such things, the solvent must evaporate. Second condition is non-zero contact angle, okay. That means the drop should take the spherical cap shape, okay. It should not be a continuous film, okay. If the contact angle is 0, okay, if the contact angle is 0, then you will not see such a phenomena. Therefore, the contact angle has to be larger than 0. Okay, that means if I were to draw this tangent here, right, this theta has to be greater than 0, and people have done experiments where theta is as small as 5 degrees, or about 10 degree. In all such cases, people have seen such coffee ring formation. And the third point is that the contact line should be pinned. Okay, I kind of discussed this earlier. A case where the contact line would be pinned would be where the diameter does not change with time. Okay, diameter remains constant, therefore the contact line is pinned in this case. However, if you have a case where the contact line continuously decreases with time, you will not get a coffee ring in this case, but in this case the coffee ring forms. Okay, if you want to know a bit more about some of those details, they are kind of published in some of the very famous works in this particular field. You can read up a little bit more on that. Now coming back to explaining, okay, why are these particles even going to the edge? Okay. Okay, so to kind of explain that, I have to introduce a term called evaporative flux. Okay, one way to think about this would be, so evaporative flux, you can think about it like the amount of water that is lost from the drop per unit area. Okay, okay, something like you can express this in terms of kg of water, right, lost, okay, per some area per time, right. Now, so what is done here is a simple expression that is given here that will help us to convince ourselves that this evaporative flux, right, this JFR is actually not the same across the entire drop surface. It is very small towards the center, and as you move away from the center of the drop towards the edge, this J basically goes up. Okay, one of the simplest ways to get that would be this JFR is proportional to R minus R to the power of minus lambda. This lambda depends on the contact angle, right here. Okay, for the simplicity, we will take lambda to be 1. Okay, right. You can get actual lambda, but that's not important at this point. So therefore, this JFR is actually proportional to 1 divided by R minus R, because R minus R to the power of minus 1. Therefore, GFR is basically proportional to 1 divided by R minus R, right. At the center, okay, because this is a drop like that, okay, that's your, this is R is equal to 0, and here R is equal to capital R, right. At the center, R is equal to 0, therefore this is going to be 1 over R, right. And therefore if you move towards the edge, right, this reduces, right. If I go towards the edge, this reduces, but 1 over something that's smaller increases, right. 1 over something that is smaller than R would increase, right. Basically we are talking about 1 by R at the center, okay, versus, okay, 1 by R minus R as you go right towards, right. So therefore, so basically this is a simple kind of a thought where you should imagine that the evaporative flux is smaller at the center, and as you go away towards the edge, the evaporative flux goes up. Now what this evaporative flux does is that means there is a loss of more liquid at the edge, and because of the fact that so let me just come back, right. I mentioned that this has to be pinned like this, right. I mentioned that this line or the contact line has to be pinned, and because of the fact that there is more liquid loss from the edge, in order to keep it pinned, the liquid from the interior goes to the edge. Okay, that means there is a liquid flow that is generated because of the evaporation process, and that evaporation is process is basically carrying the particles to the edge, and that's what leads to the coffee ring formation. Just to make yourself more clear, so I have a nice movie to show that effect. This is some experiments from our lab, and so this is okay. I'm just going to play this movie a couple of times so that you understand. So what we've done is an experiment where you had a liquid drop, right, and it contains 5 micrometer particles, and okay, we were actually seeing things from the top, right. This is an optical microscopy video where we are seeing things from the top, and we are basically recording what is happening to the, or we are basically capturing what is happening to the fate of the particles as the liquid basically evaporates. Okay. Now what should we, there's a radial flow, there's a flow from the center towards the edge, right, and there's a particulate accumulation at the edge, and what we had also measured was this normalized width. Okay. When I say width, or in simple terms, you can say this is a width, right. Okay, this is a from here to the edge is a width of the ring. Now, so you see that the width changes very little initially, but it goes up by a big amount towards the end, right. That means, so when these things dry, the accumulation of particles at the edge, is little slower in the beginning, right, and towards the end of evaporation, okay, there is a fast accumulation. That's why this width basically goes up quite a bit in the last stages, right. So these are some simple observations that you can do when you do experiments in the lab, and there's a lot of work that has gone in understanding why is it that it kind of goes up minimally in the beginning, and why does it go up by a large extent towards the end. Is there are some there's some understanding of why where that comes from. The second insight that you can get from doing some simple experiments is particle clustering during the final stages. So what I want you to do is to pay attention to the particles in the drop. You see, if you look at these particles, right, they're kind of individual particles, they are kind of moving individually, but then towards the end these particles come together and they form clusters, right. And this clustering is again because of some interesting interparticle forces that are developed during drying. Maybe I can give a bit more details about it at some point, but you see that the clustering, now the clusters are very nicely visible, right. These clusters that are formed because of what is called as a liquid bridge, right. What happens, there's liquid to begin with, it dries up, okay. At some point what will happen is the height of the liquid becomes smaller than the size of the particle, right. That means I should imagine two particles, and the height between the two particles becomes smaller and smaller. Then there's a meniscus that is developed, and that meniscus basically brings the particle together, okay. They're called what are called as immersion capillary forces, okay, in the technical terms, okay. That means these are particles are drawn towards each other because of the capillary bridge, liquid bridge formed between the two particles, okay. There are some, okay. So the next nice movie I wanted to show is so I showed you some nice movies where, so this is, now we are talking about again formation of coffee ring, but then if you observe what is happening at the edge, okay, if you observe what is happening at the edge, so that's my contact line, right. But if you see the gap between the contact line and this particle, right, it is increasing, right. See, they were here earlier, right. Maybe let me just play it again. Okay. hopefully it will come. Yeah. Right. So if you look at carefully, towards the beginning of the drying process, these particles at the edge, right, they are deposited closer to the contact line, but with time, the gap between the contact line and these particle layers, it basically goes up. Okay, and this is the quantitative information. You see this distance is increasing with time, right? That is because the interface is basically coming down, right? What you should imagine is the interface is basically coming down, and the interface that is coming down is basically pushing the particles inward, right? Initially, they were almost close to the contact line, but then with time they are pushed inward. That means the distance basically increases, right? Stuff like that. Okay, you can do some nice experiments to understand all these deposition processes nicely, because that will help you to understand the technological relevance of these things in various different fields. I just want to end by showing that. So this is again experiments in the lab where we had taken a liquid drop containing these particles. This is about 500 nanometers, very small rice-like particles. And as I said, if you dry it in the sessile drop mode, you get a ring like that, right? But it turns out that in a lot of technological applications, this is not favorable. For example, if I want a good quality print, right? I don't want a coffee ring, but I want a uniform deposition of particles, right? I don't want everything to go and sit at the edge. I want everything to be uniformly distributed throughout the deposit area, right? You can do that, okay? There are cases where you can do experiments under exactly same conditions, but I play with the particle interactions and substrate type and stuff like that, and I can get a uniform deposition like that. Or I can do an experiment in a pendant drop mode or in a hanging drop, and I can generate patterns where things are more in the central region, right? Or I can do an experiment in a vertical configuration and have particles deposited on one side, okay? Or I can do experiments between two parallel plates, right? I have two parallel plates, exactly same experiment. All that I have done is, instead of taking drop on a substrate, I take another plate and put it on top of it. You can get a configuration of the initial liquid drop like that, and then if it dries, it forms these beautiful spiral patterns, okay? So what I've discussed so far today, it comes under a very broad field of research called evaporation driven self-assembly. Okay, so what people do is they do simple experiments of starting with a particulate dispersion or a dispersion of particles, dispersion of polymers, dispersion of complex mixture of different things, and then they observe things as things evaporate, right? And then it's all about controlling the assembly of particles, right? In the experiments here, the particles are all assembled at the edge because of the evaporation process, right? They self-assemble themselves. Okay, you don't have to do anything, right? Just by the action of the different things happening during the course of evaporation, everything goes and settles at the edge, right? Or goes and remains at the edge. Or I can make it kind of uniformly deposit, right? So all of this is basically I'm able to control their assembly just by doing a simple evaporation process. Okay, so this is a huge field where there's a lot of interest. I'll just end by answering a couple of your questions, right? One is about what if you have mixtures, right? Again, there are a lot of nice experiments in the field in which what people have done is this. Okay, I take a droplet. Okay, say I have particles that are smaller and bigger. Okay. Now, as I said, of course, the particle should not be too big, right? If it is say 20 micrometer, then what will happen is the gravity acting on the particle is too big. Okay, it doesn't experience any evaporation driven processes. It will just settle by gravity. Okay, therefore if you have a mixture of very large particles and smaller particles, okay, if it is much larger, then larger particles will settle down just because of gravity, but smaller ones will go to the edge. Okay. If I have like say 5 micrometer particles and like smaller ones, then what will happen is both of them can experience the evaporation driven flows, both of them will go to the edge, but if you look carefully, the size here is smaller than the size here, right? What people have seen is that 5 micrometer particles will stay here and then the smaller ones will go there. Okay, people talk about what is the sorting of particles, right? Or if I have a mixture of 3 particles, people can get, basically I said this coffee ring, right, where particles are there at the edge, they get 3 rings. Okay, if you have 3 types of particles, one for the largest, this is for the middle sized, this is for the smallest, right? This is for the smallest, middle size, this is for the largest. So there are people who have looked at some extension of some of these works where they have looked at mixtures of the particle of different sizes, particle of different shapes. What happens if you have particles plus polymer, right? So I have not talked about the details of some of those things, but I just give you a broad picture of what this is all about. So yeah. That was your question. You had a question. Yeah. So when does things go in a constant contact radius mode versus constant contact angle mode, right? That was a question. So see, for the constant contact radius mode to occur, as I said, the side view would look like this, right? It is something like that for the constant contact radius mode, right? So that means the contact line has to be pinned, right? And the general understanding is that if you take any surface, right? If I take any substrate, glass, table, saucer, whatever, right? And if I look at these surfaces, through if you want to call it as a nanoscope, right? It turns out that these surfaces are not perfectly smooth. There are some nanoscale heterogeneities. Okay, there are, you should think about them being not perfectly smooth, and these heterogeneities ensure that the pinning occurs. Okay, pinning, right? That's when the constant contact radius mode would occur. But there are methods by which I can create what are called as atomically smooth surfaces. That means I don't have these heterogeneities, they are perfectly smooth, atomically smooth. Okay, in such case the pinning is not favored. Okay, therefore the drops, what they do is they continuously slip. Okay, they are not pinned, they slip as the evaporation occurs. So therefore an atomically smooth surfaces is when the constant contact angle mode of evaporation occurs. Yeah, people have, there are techniques where you can make such things. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point as well. There are cases, so I kind of talked about 2 extreme cases of either constant contact radius or constant contact angle mode of drying, but it turns out that in practically it's sometimes it's a combination of both. Okay, there could be a majority of the period where CCR occurs and maybe a small portion of the time during which this may occur. Okay, one may dominate over the other. That depends on what kind of liquids you are working with, what is the substrate type and things like that. Yeah.
Why is evaporative flux larger at the edges? Like, I understand that from the formula says, but why is that so?
The simple answer to that would be it just comes from the geometry of the drop. Okay, if I have a flat surface, okay, so if I take a if I have a like say substrate, okay, which is like say perfectly hydrophilic, right? Then you'll get a thin film, right? On a thin film, the evaporative flux is same everywhere, right? I take this region versus this region, it will be exactly same, right? But yeah, so therefore the drop shape plays a role here, and the pinning also plays a role. Okay, it's a combination of that what leads to this. Yeah, I can maybe refer to some literature for you to read. That paper that I put up, right, 1997 Nature paper, that talks about some of those details. Any more questions? Because Vijayan is here, so maybe then I'll stop here. Yeah, thank you so much.